There are houses that simply shelter the living, and there are houses that absorb the dead. Stones that remember footsteps long after the people who made them are gone. Walls that listened when whispers turned into accusations, when loyalty became treason, and when survival demanded blood. This mansion did not merely host history. It watched history unravel. Within these walls, kings rose believing their power eternal, only to leave broken or not leave at all. Marriages were forged for alliances and dissolved with steel. Brothers turned against brothers. Queens prayed behind locked doors, while courtiers sharpened knives in the corridors outside. Every torch-lit hallway carried secrets. Every window overlooked ambition. Every chamber became a witness. This was not just a home. It was a political weapon disguised as stone. To understand how a single mansion could witness murder, betrayal, and the rise and fall of an entire dynasty, we must return to a time when England itself was uncertain, fragile, and violently personal. When power lived not in institutions, but in proximity to the king. And when survival depended on being close enough to rule, but not close enough to die. Long before it became a symbol of royal paranoia and dynastic collapse, the mansion began as something far more modest, a statement of ambition carved into brick and stone along the River Thames. In the early 16th century, England was not yet the empire it would become. It was a kingdom still recovering from civil war, still haunted by the Wars of the Roses, and still uncertain whether peace could last beyond the lifespan of a single ruler. Power was centralized, but fragile. A strong king could unify the realm, a weak one could destroy it. The mansion that would later witness the most intimate crimes of the Tudor dynasty was originally conceived as a private residence, not for a king, but for a man who understood power better than most monarchs ever would. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey was not born into nobility. He rose through intelligence, political instinct, and an unmatched ability to serve his king's desires. By 1515, he was Archbishop of York, Lord Chancellor of England, and the most powerful man in the country after the king himself. He needed a residence that reflected his position, not merely comfortable, but intimidating. A place that announced authority before a single word was spoken. Construction began along the Thames at Hampton, a strategic location close enough to London for governance, yet distant enough to offer control, privacy, and spectacle. The river functioned as both highway and shield. Anyone approaching by water would see the mansion rising from the shoreline, symmetrical, fortified, deliberate. This was architecture as political language. Red brick walls projected permanence. Towering chimneys symbolized wealth. Courtyards were designed not just for beauty, but for observation, spaces where movement could be watched, alliances formed, and loyalties tested. Every archway framed power. Every corridor guided behavior. But Wolsey built too well. When King Henry VIII first visited the mansion, he immediately recognized its potential, not as a guest, but as an owner. The palace offered something the medieval castles of England did not: comfort without vulnerability, grandeur without isolation. It was a place where a king could rule not from a throne, but from intimacy, dinners, conversations, glances exchanged across rooms. Wolsey understood the danger instantly, and it did not save him. By 1529, Wolsey had fallen from favor, unable to secure Henry the annulment he desperately wanted. His power evaporated as quickly as it had risen. Facing arrest and disgrace, Wolsey surrendered the mansion to the crown in a final attempt at survival. The king accepted. From that moment forward, the mansion ceased to belong to any man. It belonged to the monarchy, and to whatever darkness the monarchy carried within it. Henry VIII transformed the residence into a royal palace, expanding it aggressively. New wings stretched outward like grasping arms. Kitchens capable of feeding 1,000 courtiers were installed. Great halls grew taller, louder, more theatrical. The architecture mirrored Henry himself, indulgent, dominating, and increasingly dangerous. This palace was no longer a home. It was a stage. And on this stage, England's most violent domestic drama was about to unfold. When Henry VIII claimed the mansion as his own, he did not simply inherit a building. He inherited a mechanism, one capable of controlling space, people, and ultimately fate itself. What had once been Wolsey's carefully balanced residence became something far more dangerous under a king who believed power was a personal right, not a responsibility. Henry did not rule from distance. He ruled from presence. He needed to see, to hear, to be surrounded. The palace allowed him exactly that. Rooms were redesigned not for privacy, but for hierarchy. Who stood closest to the king during meals mattered more than titles written on paper. Corridors were narrowed where secrecy was useful, widened where spectacle was required. Access became the true currency of survival. The mansion began to function like a living organism, responding to the king's moods. When Henry was confident, the court expanded. When he grew suspicious, doors closed, guards multiplied, and silence thickened. It was here that Henry's marriages stopped being personal unions and became state experiments, trials in loyalty, fertility, and obedience. Each queen entered the palace with hope carefully rehearsed, unaware that the building itself had already decided how long she would last. Catherine of Aragon walked these halls, knowing her marriage was under threat. The rooms that once echoed with celebration gradually became spaces of quiet resistance. Catherine refused to leave, refused to accept invalidation, and refused to disappear politely. The palace responded with isolation. Her access to the king shrank. Her allies were removed. Even architecture conspired against her, chambers reassigned, routes altered, proximity denied. When Anne Boleyn arrived, the mansion transformed again. An understood performance. She understood danger. She knew that survival required more than affection. It required constant visibility. She moved through the palace deliberately, aligning herself with power corridors, appearing at moments designed to unsettle rivals. For a time, the building rewarded her, but the same corridors that elevated and also recorded her downfall. By the mid-1530s, Henry's paranoia had hardened into doctrine. Loyalty was no longer assumed. It had to be proven daily. The palace became a listening device. Servants overheard conversations and repeated them upward. Doors were never fully trusted. Even silence became suspicious. Anne's apartments, once symbols of triumph, became cages. Accusations moved faster than evidence. Whispers outran truth. And inside the palace, justice was not about proof. It was about convenience. When Anne Boleyn left the palace for the last time, she did not leave defeated. She left condemned. The mansion had witnessed the full arc of her rise and fall, absorbing every step without mercy. Henry remarried again, and again. Each time, the palace adjusted. New chambers, new expectations, new victims. Jane Seymour died not by execution, but by childbirth, turning the palace into a house of mourning and fear. The corridors fell quiet. Even Henry, momentarily humbled, avoided the spaces where she had walked. Catherine Howard would not be so fortunate. Young, isolated, and surrounded by predators disguised as courtiers, Catherine's movements were watched obsessively. The palace had learned how to expose weakness. Her private meetings became public knowledge. Her past became a weapon. And when she was arrested, it happened not in secrecy, but deliberately, so that everyone would see what disobedience cost. By the time Catherine Parr arrived, the mansion was no longer just a royal residence. It was a psychological battlefield. Catherine survived only by mastering silence, obedience, and timing. She understood that the palace rewarded those who vanished before suspicion arrived. The mansion had done its work. It had not only housed power, it had shaped it. By the late 1530s, the mansion had become something far more dangerous than a royal residence. It was now an instrument of fear, refined through repetition. Everyone who entered understood the rules, even if they were never spoken aloud. Trust was temporary. Silence was survival, and visibility was fatal if it lasted too long. Executions did not begin at the scaffold. They began in the corridors. Inside the palace, arrest was not a legal procedure. It was a performance. The moment guards appeared, the outcome was already decided. There were no trials meant to discover truth, only confirmations designed to justify a choice already made. The mansion provided the setting where this transition from favor to doom could occur instantly and publicly. Courtiers learned to read the palace the way sailors read weather. A closed door at the wrong hour could signal disaster. A missing name at dinner meant exile or worse. The building itself communicated danger long before words did. Thomas Cromwell understood this better than anyone. Cromwell rose within these walls by mastering proximity. He knew when to appear and when to vanish. He learned which staircases were safest, which rooms echoed, and which corridors carried secrets upward. 4 years, the mansion rewarded his instincts. He became indispensable, orchestrating religious transformation, confiscating church wealth, and eliminating rivals with efficiency disguised as reform. But the palace never protected anyone forever. When Cromwell arranged Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, it was meant to secure alliances and stability. Instead, it exposed the king's vanity and cruelty. Henry blamed the building itself for his disappointment, claiming deception before even blaming his advisors. Cromwell's access shrank, his footsteps became watched. His silence was no longer strategic. It was suspicious. His arrest took place not on a battlefield, but within the familiar spaces he once controlled. The corridors did not react. They had seen this before. Cromwell's execution confirmed a rule the palace enforced relentlessly. Architects of power are always temporary residents. As Cromwell fell, the machinery of fear continued to operate without pause. Nobles, once confident in bloodlines and titles, now understood that ancestry offered no immunity. The palace had shifted England's political reality. Loyalty was no longer inherited. It was evaluated daily. Even servants were not safe. Records describe household staff interrogated, dismissed, and occasionally imprisoned for what they overheard, repeated, or failed to report. The palace turned listening into labor, silence into suspicion, movement into risk. At night, the mansion changed character. Torchlight distorted walls into watching faces. Footsteps echoed longer than they should have. Rooms once designed for comfort now felt exposed, as though the building itself refused privacy. The palace did not need ghosts. It manufactured fear while everyone was still alive. When Henry VIII aged, grew ill, and increasingly violent in temper, the palace reflected his decay. Repairs were rushed, extensions became uneven. Comfort gave way to control. Accessibility mattered more than beauty. The mansion no longer tried to impress, it tried to contain. By the time Henry died in 1547, the palace had outlived his certainty. It remained standing, but the dynasty he believed eternal was already fracturing, and the mansion waited. When Henry VIII died, the palace did not mourn. It did not celebrate. It simply absorbed the absence. For nearly 2 decades, its identity had been shaped around a single presence, loud, commanding, and volatile. With that presence gone, the mansion felt unnaturally restrained, as though it was holding its breath. Power passed not to certainty, but to fragility. Edward VI entered the palace as a child surrounded by adults who governed in his name and feared his mortality. The mansion, once calibrated to flatter a dominant king, now revealed its scale as a liability. Rooms designed for authority dwarfed the boy king. Corridors that once directed power now swallowed it. Decision-making shifted behind closed doors, away from public ritual. Advisors whispered where proclamations once echoed. The palace adapted again, not to tyranny, but to vulnerability. Edward's illness transformed the mansion into a place of watchfulness rather than spectacle. Windows remained shuttered, movement was controlled. Physicians replaced courtiers as the most frequent occupants of private chambers. The palace, so accustomed to political drama, became a space of quiet anxiety. When Edward died in 1553, the silence deepened. Mary I inherited not only the throne, but the accumulated fear embedded in the walls. She entered the palace as a ruler defined by contradiction, determined, devout, and acutely aware of how easily authority could be taken away. The mansion mirrored her reign. Public ceremonies returned, but joy did not. Mary ruled from within the palace cautiously, distrustful of the same corridors that had destroyed her mother. Executions continued, though their motivations shifted from dynastic paranoia to religious absolutism. The palace once again hosted death, but now it was framed as salvation rather than survival. Yet even Mary understood the danger of proximity. She preferred distance. The mansion became less central, less inhabited. Its rooms, once alive with rivalry, began to feel preserved rather than used. The palace was transitioning from engine of power to monument of memory. Elizabeth I completed that transformation. Unlike her father, Elizabeth ruled by movement. She travelled relentlessly, never allowing herself to remain too long in any one place. She understood that permanence invited conspiracy. When she visited the mansion, it was carefully staged, brief, symbolic, and controlled. Under Elizabeth, the palace ceased to be a trap because she refused to let it become one. She used it as a reminder, not a residence. The building no longer shaped power. Power learned from it. By the end of the Tudor dynasty, the mansion stood intact, but altered in meaning. It had survived kings, queens, executions, and fear. What it had not survived was intimacy. The palace was no longer trusted. By the time the Tudor dynasty ended, the mansion no longer functioned as a center of power. It had become something rarer, a survivor. Dynasties collapse loudly, but buildings endure quietly. And this one had endured enough to understand the cost of ambition better than any historian ever could. The palace was inherited by the Stuarts, renovated, repurposed, and modernized, yet its core remained unchanged. The same corridors carried new footsteps. The same chambers hosted different rulers, but something fundamental had shifted. No king ever again trusted the mansion the way Henry VIII once had. Architecture remembers what people try to forget. Every expansion, every reinforced door, every redirected hallway was a response to fear experienced firsthand. The palace had taught England an unspoken lesson. When power concentrates too tightly, it poisons itself. The walls had seen loyalty collapse under pressure, marriages weaponized for succession, faith transformed into justification, and law bent until it snapped. Murder did not always occur within these walls, but decisions leading to death almost always did. The palace was where accusations hardened into verdicts, where silence became guilt, where proximity to power offered elevation one day and annihilation the next. It revealed a truth monarchs preferred to deny. Absolute authority does not create stability. It creates isolation. Over time, the mansion transitioned from residence to symbol. Visitors came not to witness power, but to study its consequences. The palace was preserved not because it represented triumph, but because it represented warning. Even today, standing within its halls, something feels restrained. The rooms are grand, but never comforting. The scale impresses, but it does not invite. The palace does not celebrate its past, it contains it. That is its final role. This mansion witnessed murder without bloodstains, betrayal without shouted confessions, and the rise and fall of a dynasty that believed stone could make power permanent. It proved otherwise. Kings vanished, queens were erased, advisors were executed, and the building remained, silent, intact, remembering everything. History often asks who ruled, who died, and who survived. This palace answers a different question. What happens when power believes it is eternal? The walls already know.